The death of Julius Caesar in 44 BC left Rome in a state of absolute chaos, a true battlefield of political and social strife. Until then, Caesar had amassed immense power, and his almost monarchical leadership had transformed the Roman Republic. However, with his death, the empire entered an unprecedented crisis, as, in addition to the absence of strong leadership, Caesar's assassination exposed the fragilities of the Roman political structure itself. The assassination, led by a group of Roman senators, was not merely an act of personal revenge against a tyrant, but also a reflection of an internal struggle for control over the fate of Rome. The Senate believed that Caesar's death would restore the old republic, but what occurred was exactly the opposite. Instead of resolving the issue of power concentration, the act created a power vacuum and an imminent civil war. The city of Rome and its institutions found themselves divided, with different factions vying for control of an empire on the brink of collapse. Socially, Caesar's assassination also heightened divisions. The aristocratic class, represented by the senators, felt threatened by the rise of a single man who had subverted republican traditions. On the other hand, the popular masses, who had benefited from Caesar's reforms, were furious. The assassination of their leader, seen by many as a savior, created an atmosphere of instability, where loyalties and alliances were constantly being redefined. The people of Rome, for the most part, did not understand the reason for the assassination and saw their hopes for reforms being shattered at the moment the tyrant was overthrown. In this scenario, figures emerged seeking to fill the void left by Caesar, each with their own ambitions and motivations. The Roman Empire, already in decline due to its immense expansion, entered a turbulent period that would result in an endless struggle for supremacy. Every action taken after Caesar's assassination would have significant repercussions, leading Rome to decay and the birth of a new political order. The next chapter of this story was written not only in the battlefields, but also in the corridors of the Senate and in the minds of those who aspired to power. Before we begin to explore the next topic, take a moment to check if you are subscribed to the channel, because what comes next is a series of amazing videos that will help you better understand the history of Rome and how it can inspire your personal journey. Don't miss any content. The assassination of Julius Caesar in 44 BC was not a mere act of revenge, but a desperate attempt to restore the Roman Republic, which had been eroded by the rise of the leader. The motivations behind Caesar's assassination are complex and multifaceted. Roman senators feared the growing concentration of power in Caesar's hands, threatening republican traditions. Among the senators were men like Mark Antony, who had supported Caesar but became skeptical of his rule. Cassius and Brutus believed his death would return Rome to the republican system. Caesar was seen as a bearer of tyranny disguised as reforms. His death was believed to restore balance, but it led to disastrous consequences for the empire. Shortly after the assassination, Rome plunged into chaos. The act sparked an unexpected popular revolt, as Caesar was seen as a savior by many. The Roman people, who benefited from Caesar's reforms, could not understand why his leadership was forcibly taken away. His death was a tragedy for those who believed in his vision. The consequences of the assassination soon became evident. The power vacuum fueled resentment and division between the Senate and the people, creating a struggle for succession. Figures like Octavian, Caesar's nephew, and Mark Antony emerged as competitors for control of the empire. Caesar's death did not restore the Republic, but unleashed new conflicts. The assassination led Rome further away from its republican ideals, eventually towards the formation of an absolute empire. The assassination of Julius Caesar was a landmark in Roman history. The motivations, justified as restoring republican order, generated endless war and instability. The immediate impact on the empire was profound, leaving Rome more divided and vulnerable, while new leaders fought for control of an empire in ruins. After the assassination of Julius Caesar, a power vacuum emerged, leading to a struggle for control of Rome. The uncertainty opened the field for alliances and conspiracies, notably the First Triumvirate. The First Triumvirate was a political alliance aimed at restoring balance and preventing the collapse of the Roman system. Octavian, Caesar's nephew and adopted heir, was a key figure in this alliance. Octavian, despite his youth, positioned himself as Caesar's main political successor. His political skill and status as Caesar's heir placed him in a favorable position to secure support from the people and senators. Mark Antony, an experienced general loyal to Caesar, was a respected figure among the legions and the Senate. He saw himself as the true heir to Caesar's legacy, but his relationship with Octavian was complex. Antony believed he could dominate the empire with his military victories and the loyalty of his troops. However, tensions with Octavian arose due to their similar aspirations for power but different approaches. Lepidus, the third member of the Triumvirate, was a competent general and Caesar's ally. Though lacking charisma and military power, his diplomatic skill and strategic alliances kept him relevant. Lepidus was seen as a marginal figure compared to Octavian and Antony, serving as a balancer in the alliance. His forces ensured internal stability while Octavian and Antony consolidated territories. The First Triumvirate was a pragmatic alliance, not a union of ideals. The three men aimed to secure control of the empire, but their personal ambitions soon proved incompatible. Octavian, seen as Caesar's legitimate successor, knew the power of the Triumvirate couldn't be shared indefinitely. Antony, with his victories and legion loyalty, had great ambitions. Lepidus played a discreet role but saw himself as essential in the alliance. The dynamic between the three led to internal disputes, betrayals, and a struggle for total control of Rome. The temporary alliance to stabilize the empire after Caesar's death transformed into a war for supremacy. Each member sought to consolidate their power, redefining Roman politics. The struggle between Octavian, Antony, and Lepidus shaped the fate of the Roman Empire, leading to the transition from republic to empire after battles and betrayals. The Perusian War, which took place in 41 to 40 BC, was one of the decisive events that marked the weakening of Lepidus's power within the First Triumvirate, initiating the process that would lead to his political downfall. This civil war, fought in the city of Perusia, was not only a military dispute but also a manifestation of the growing tensions within the alliance between the three triumvirs, Octavian, Mark Antony, and Lepidus. At the root of the conflict was the growing discontent among several of Caesar's allies who believed that, after his death, Rome should be governed in a manner closer to the republican model, with a return to the influence of the Senate and magistrates. These allies, led by Lucius Antony, brother of Mark Antony, rebelled against the actions of Octavian and his allies. Lucius Antony, who had politically distanced himself from Octavian, sought to establish his own power base, with the city of Perusia becoming the epicenter of this resistance. While Octavian and Mark Antony focused on consolidating their forces, Lepidus, already weakened by his lack of prominence in the Triumvirate, sought to maintain his position as a mediator between the two men. However, this attempt to appease tension soon proved insufficient. The alliance among the triumvirs was fragile, and Lepidus's failure to engage directly in the war at Perusia, preferring to focus on secondary military issues, led him to be seen as incapable of acting decisively. During the conflict, Lucius Antony's forces managed to resist strongly, but the troops loyal to Octavian eventually besieged Perusia, forcing Lucius Antony to surrender. This confrontation had direct implications for Lepidus's position, as his failure to take decisive action during the war progressively marginalized him within the Triumvirate. Unlike Octavian and Mark Antony, who were deeply involved in their campaigns and knew how to use conflicts to consolidate their power, Lepidus appeared increasingly devoid of any military strength or solid political support base. Lepidus's weakening was evident not only in his ability to control territory but also in the loss of respect and support within the Senate and the Roman troops. While Octavian and Mark Antony emerged stronger, Lepidus became isolated, with his political figure increasingly devalued. Instead of using the war to strengthen his position, as his colleagues had done, Lepidus found himself reduced to a mere spectator, lacking the support of the legions, which resulted in his loss of influence. This weakening of Lepidus, combined with the growing rivalry between Octavian and Mark Antony, helped pave the way for the disintegration of the Triumvirate. The defeat of Lucius Antony at Perusia and the subsequent weakening of Lepidus not only exposed the weaknesses of the Triumvirate but also accelerated the power struggle between Octavian and Mark Antony, who, as time passed, became increasingly irreconcilable. The civil war at Perusia, therefore, was not just a military conflict but also a landmark in the disintegration of collective power, resulting in Lepidus's disappearance from the Roman political scene. And the beginning of the final confrontation between Octavian and Mark Antony, which would, over time, forever change the course of Roman history. The conflict between Octavian and Mark Antony did not arise abruptly, but was the result of a series of tensions accumulated over several years, fueled by power struggles, personal ambitions, and divergent political interests. Both had been allies during the First Triumvirate, but their differences began to become increasingly evident as their power bases expanded and their visions for the future of Rome diverged. This clash, which would later become the civil war between the two, was marked by a profound erosion of the alliance that initially united the two men after the death of Julius Caesar. After Caesar's assassination, Octavian, the dictator's designated heir, quickly began consolidating his power in Italy and the western provinces. His ability to manipulate public opinion and his control over Rome positioned him as Caesar's legitimate successor. However, Mark Antony, who at the time governed the Eastern Empire and had a strong military base, also considered himself Caesar's natural successor. Additionally, he had the support of Cleopatra, the Queen of Egypt, with whom he maintained a personal and political relationship that only heightened the rivalry between the two. The growing tension between them became evident when Octavian began to question Antony's actions, especially his connection with Cleopatra and his increasingly autonomous stance in the East. For Octavian, Antony's alliance with Cleopatra represented a direct threat to the unity of Rome, as well as an affront to Caesar's legacy. He began disseminating propaganda against Antony, accusing him of treason and of trying to make Rome an extension of Egypt, something completely unacceptable to the Roman elite. Octavian capitalized on this narrative to become increasingly popular among senators and the more conservative classes of the city. On the other hand, Mark Antony, who believed he was the true defender of the empire, saw Octavian as an ambitious young man and often as a threat to the power he had already gained. He was unwilling to cede control of the eastern provinces without a fight, especially knowing of Octavian's growing strength in Rome. Antony's relationship with Cleopatra, which was widely used against him by Octavian, became one of the keys to further intensifying the dispute. For Antony, his alliance with the Egyptian queen was not only personal but strategic, as Egypt was a crucial economic power for the empire. The confrontations began to escalate when both became involved in a series of diplomatic and military confrontations, making war inevitable. The tensions culminated in the famous Battle of Actium in 31 BC, where Octavian's forces, led by him and Commander Agrippa, faced Antony's and Cleopatra's forces. The conflict was not only a military battle but also a confrontation of legacies and ideas about the future of Rome. Octavian fought for the preservation of the republican order, even if it meant centralizing power in his hands, while Antony fought for a more inclusive empire. Antony sought an empire that recognized the contributions of the eastern provinces and their allies. The defeat of Antony and Cleopatra at the Battle of Actium was a definitive turning point in the history of Rome. Antony, seeing the defeat as irreversible, committed suicide, and Cleopatra followed his example shortly after. With the death of both, Octavian emerged as the sole ruler of Rome, putting an end to any possibility of real resistance. Thus, the tension between Octavian and Antony not only gave rise to a civil war but also to a complete reconfiguration of Rome's political structure. Rome would quickly transition from a weakened republic to an empire under the absolute control of a single emperor. The confrontation between Octavian and Mark Antony was more than a dispute over territories, it was a struggle for the definition of Rome's future and for control of Caesar's legacy. While Octavian presented himself as the restorer of Roman order, Antony sought to keep alive the idea of a diverse Rome. Antony envisioned a Rome where the eastern provinces would play a central role. This difference in visions, combined with political intrigues and personal manipulations, led to the destruction of one of the most powerful alliances in the history of Rome. The conflict resulted in the emergence of a new era under Octavian's empire. The Battle of Philippi, fought in 42 BC, was a decisive point in the Roman civil war, where Caesar's assassins, led by Brutus and Cassius, faced the armies of the Triumvirs, commanded by Octavian and Mark Antony. This confrontation was a symbolic battle, marked by issues of revenge, loyalty, and power. After Caesar's assassination, Brutus and Cassius attempted to establish themselves as leaders and restorers of the Republic, claiming they acted for freedom and Rome's well-being. However, Caesar's death led to new contenders seeking control of the empire, with Octavian's government and Mark Antony growing stronger. The civil war intensified as both sides mobilized to control Rome and the empire. Octavian and Mark Antony, united in the Second Triumvirate, saw the fight against Brutus and Cassius as a chance to avenge Caesar's death and consolidate power. Brutus and Cassius believed their victory would restore Roman freedom. The battle took place in two confrontations in October 42 BC, near Philippi in Thrace. Brutus and Cassius had a considerable army but faced cohesion and resource issues. The Triumvirs' forces, well-trained and strategically superior, were commanded by two of Rome's most powerful men. The first battle was fought near the battlefield. Brutus achieved some initial success, but Mark Antony's numerical superiority and military experience prevailed. Cassius and Brutus's forces began to yield, and Cassius, seeing his cause lost, committed suicide, symbolizing the Republican movement's failure. The second battle was decisive, ending with Brutus's forces' complete defeat. Despite fierce resistance, Brutus couldn't withstand the Triumvir forces' final assault. Feeling his cause lost, he committed suicide, along with many followers. With their deaths, resistance against Octavian and Mark Antony was crushed. The victory at Philippi was a milestone in Rome's struggle for supremacy, with lasting consequences. For Octavian and Mark Antony, it meant revenge for Caesar's death and power consolidation. For Republican ideals, the defeat marked the Roman Republic's end, replaced by the empire's rise. Philippi became a symbol of the struggle between the old order and new power. The stage was set for Octavian, the future Augustus, to become Rome's sole ruler. The battle was not just a military defeat for Brutus and Cassius, but an ideological defeat for those believing in the Republic's restoration. The victory of the Triumvirs marked the end of any real attempt to resist Rome's power centralization. Internal rivalries continued, but the path to the empire was laid. Octavian became the main archetype of the new political order, with the Roman Republic's end and the Roman Empire's foundation under a single ruler. The Roman Empire experienced chaos after Caesar's death, nearly crumbling due to a conflict between former allies. The power struggle turned Rome into a battlefield, shaping the empire's future. Share your thoughts on this instability and whether the civil wars could have been avoided. The relationship between Mark Antony and Cleopatra was a significant romance and a turning point in Rome's political dynamics. Their alliance had profound implications, accentuating divisions within the Roman Republic and accelerating the collapse of the republican system and the rise of the Roman Empire. Cleopatra, the powerful Queen of Egypt, and Mark Antony, a Roman leader, became symbols of dramatic changes, where military, political, and personal power boundaries were reconfigured. After the Battle of Philippi, Antony became a central figure in the empire, especially in the east. Mark Antony established himself as a military commander in the east and, upon visiting Egypt, found a strategic ally in Cleopatra. She was a woman of intelligence and charm, manipulating her kingdom's power to ensure her survival and influence, recognizing opportunities with Antony. The romance between Mark Antony and Cleopatra, initiated by political interests, transformed into an intimate relationship impacting Roman politics. Cleopatra, with a history of alliances with Rome, used her seduction and diplomacy to reinforce her position and secure Antony's support. In return, Mark Antony received resources and military support to continue his campaign in the East, solidifying his authority over Roman territories. Their alliance had profound repercussions on political alliances, with Antony seen by many Romans as a traitor to his homeland. Mark Antony's embrace of Cleopatra as a political ally was viewed as a threat to Rome's unity. Many saw this as a betrayal of the republican spirit, governed by alliances and institutions representing a free Rome. Antony was portrayed as more loyal to Egypt and Cleopatra than to Rome. The alliance had a strong propaganda component, with Antony declaring his children with Cleopatra as future rulers of the East. The idea of an Egyptian-Roman dynasty caused uproar in Rome, where a Hellenistic monarchy in Egypt influencing Rome's future was unacceptable. The propagation of this idea, along with grand festivities and the ceremonial marriage between Antony and Cleopatra, intensified resentment and fear that Rome was about to be dominated by a foreign monarchy. This political marriage and Cleopatra's support for Mark Antony became one of the factors that distanced the two triumvirs, Octavian and Mark Antony. Octavian, who already had his own ambitions for power, used Mark Antony's relationship with Cleopatra as a propaganda tool against him. Strategically, Octavian appealed to Roman patriotism, drawing attention to the risk of Rome becoming a province of an Egyptian empire. He painted Mark Antony as someone who had been led astray by a foreign woman and was putting Rome's interests second. As a result, the growing rivalry between Mark Antony and Octavian became more evident. The two men, now in open war, were ready to settle their disputes on the battlefield. The alliance between Mark Antony and Cleopatra began to be seen as a direct threat to the future of Rome. Cleopatra, with her political cunning and charm, was used as a symbol of decadence and foreign power lust. However, for Mark Antony, the alliance with Cleopatra represented a possibility to restore the power and influence he had lost to Octavian. He believed that Egypt could be the center of a new Roman Empire in the East. The relationship between Mark Antony and Cleopatra was not merely a matter of love and desire, but an alliance that transformed the balance of power in Rome. Politics, love, betrayal, and loyalty intertwined in a complex and irreversible manner, and the legacy of this relationship still resonates in the stories of Roman politics and world history. It not only sealed the fate of Mark Antony and Cleopatra, but also marked the beginning of the end of the Roman Republic and the birth of an empire dominated by a single figure of authority. The Battle of Actium, fought in 31 BC, was the turning point that sealed the fate of Mark Antony and ensured Octavian's dominance over the Roman Empire. The confrontation, which took place in the waters near the coast of Actium, Greece, was not just a military battle, but also the climax of an intense struggle for power that divided the Roman world. It symbolized the final confrontation between two giants of power in Mark Antony, with his alliance with Cleopatra, and Octavian, who had the ambition to consolidate his total control over Rome. The political landscape leading to this battle had already been marked by years of growing rivalry between the two men. After the death of Julius Caesar, Mark Antony tried to solidify his position as one of the main leaders of Rome, but at the same time, he became involved in a political and personal alliance with Cleopatra, the Queen of Egypt, which brought him more enemies than allies within Rome. His relationship with Cleopatra and his plans to establish a dynasty in the eastern Roman territories were seen as threats to the Roman Republic, fueling Octavian's resentment, who sought to centralize power and eliminate any threat to his authority. Octavian, on the other hand, skillfully manipulated Roman politics, maintaining an image as a defender of the Republic and Julius Caesar's legacy, while gathering political and military strength to challenge Mark Antony. he exploited propaganda, especially by publicizing Mark Antony's relationship with Cleopatra, portraying him as a traitor who was putting Rome at risk by allying with a foreign queen. The use of this rhetoric, combined with his strategic skill, enabled Octavian to win the loyalty of many senators and Roman citizens. The Battle of Actium was, therefore, more than just a naval dispute, it was a reflection of the clash between two distinct visions for the future of Rome. Mark Antony, with his powerful army and fleet, and Cleopatra, with the support of her resources and Egyptian troops, believed they could win and reverse the political situation against Octavian. However, the battle was marked by a series of strategic errors and leadership failures on Mark Antony's side. His army, although numerically superior, was poorly coordinated, and his fleet failed to execute the decisive attacks that could have changed the course of the war. The disunity of his forces and the lack of cohesion among his commanders made him vulnerable. The decisive factor, however, was the desertion of part of his fleet. Many of the admirals and crew members of Mark Antony's fleet, who were dissatisfied with his leadership and choices, switched sides to Octavian. The outcome of this turn was Mark Antony's flight to Egypt, where he and Cleopatra hoped to reorganize their forces and launch one last attempt at resistance. However, this was already enough to secure Octavian's victory. His victory at the Battle of Actium not only crushed Mark Antony's military resistance but also destroyed the latter's support base, both in Rome and in other regions of the empire. With Mark Antony's defeat, Octavian consolidated his power and became, without contest, the sole ruler of Rome. He returned to Rome as a hero, triumphant, and after a period of transition, was crowned with the title of Augustus, marking the end of the Roman Republic and the beginning of the Roman Empire. The Battle of Actium, therefore, was not just a military event, but also the watershed that forever changed the course of Roman history, ushering in a new era of imperial domination. Mark Antony's defeat also had broader repercussions for Egypt. Queen Cleopatra, without Mark Antony's military support, saw her kingdom rapidly weaken. Unable to sustain a prolonged war against Octavian, she and Mark Antony committed suicide, putting an end to any possibility of Egyptian resistance. Egypt was then annexed by Octavian, consolidating his victory and ensuring control over all territories around the Mediterranean, while he reinforced his absolute power. The Battle of Actium, therefore, was key to the definitive decline of Mark Antony and the strengthening of Octavian. It not only destroyed the military strength of the adversary, but also transformed Octavian into the uncontested leader of Rome. The battle paved the way for his rise to the title of emperor and the establishment of the Roman Empire. The battle was not just a military victory, it was the victory of Octavian's project to unify Rome under his leadership, leaving behind the era of republics and opening the doors to the imperial era that would define the future of Roman civilization. After the decisive defeat at the Battle of Actium, the fate of Mark Antony and Cleopatra was sealed. Their alliance, once seen as a threat to the centralized power of Rome, was now crumbling. Mark Antony, whose forces were crushed by Octavian, saw no way out and, desperate, fled with Cleopatra to Egypt. Together, they tried to gather strength for a final resistance, but the scenario was clear: their cause was lost. Rome, now in the hands of Octavian, would not allow any possibility of challenge to its dominion. The situation of Mark Antony and Cleopatra reflected the tragic end of an era. Both had been prominent figures in the Roman political and military landscape, with Mark Antony being one of the most respected leaders of the Republic and Cleopatra a powerful queen of Egypt. Their alliance, both personal and political, was seen by many in Rome as an attempt to conquer the empire for themselves. Octavian's victory at Actium not only destroyed Mark Antony's military forces but also weakened his support base. Many of his allies began to distance themselves, recognizing that Octavian was now the undisputed ruler. With the defeat and the imminent fall of their last resistance, Mark Antony and Cleopatra made the tragic decision to end their lives. Their suicide was a dramatic moment that marked the end of an era of internal strife in Rome and the collapse of the last great attempt to restore the Republic. For Mark Antony, his defeat meant not only the end of his career, but also the loss of the honor and dignity he had always cherished. For Cleopatra, her death was also the end of a long struggle for power, which began with her rise to the throne of Egypt and culminated in her attempt to dominate the Roman world alongside Mark Antony. Accounts of the suicides of Mark Antony and Cleopatra are filled with tragedy and symbolism. According to historical sources, Mark Antony, upon learning of Cleopatra's death, who supposedly had committed suicide before him, fell into despair and, after attempting to take his own life, was brought to Cleopatra while she was still alive. She welcomed him into her arms, and their last act together was a romantic yet political tragedy. With their deaths, Octavian not only conquered Egypt but also gained absolute control over the entire Mediterranean and ensured that there would be no further resistance to his power. The impact of this tragic end reverberated throughout Rome. The suicides of Mark Antony and Cleopatra not only put an end to the attempt to resist Octavian's dominion, but also signaled the total defeat of the Roman Republic and the birth of a new era, where power would be centralized and absolute, leaving no room for the internal disputes that had marked the last century of Roman history. The deaths of both sealed the fate of Rome, not only by removing two of the most influential figures of their time from the game, but also by giving Octavian total and unquestionable control of the empire. With the suicides of Mark Antony and Cleopatra, Octavian emerged as the sole ruler of Rome. What was once a fragmented republic in constant struggle for power now became an empire under his leadership. He not only secured his reign, but also consolidated the power of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, which would govern Rome for several generations. The suicides of Mark Antony and Cleopatra were not just the end of two lives, but the turning point that would shape the future of Rome for centuries, transforming it from a republic into a global empire. This tragic event also had a strong impact on the internal politics of Rome. From this moment on, any attempt to form alliances against the emperor would be much more difficult. The example of Mark Antony and Cleopatra served as a clear warning to anyone who dared to challenge Octavian. Their fate was sealed, and the empire was ready to advance under a new regime. The deaths of Cleopatra and Mark Antony were not only the last resistance to Octavian's power, but also the signal that, for Rome, the Republic had come to an end, giving way to the Roman Empire. The suicides of these two emblematic figures marked the end of an era of greatness and ambition. Simultaneously, it inaugurated a period of stability, at least apparent, under the rule of Octavian, now Augustus, the first emperor of Rome. Although the Roman Empire faced challenges and crises throughout its existence, this event was key to the consolidation of imperial power and the structure that would shape the future of Rome. With the death of Mark Antony and Cleopatra, the path was finally clear for Octavian, who would become the dominant figure in Rome. The young politician, who was once merely an heir to Julius Caesar's greatness, now found himself at the helm of the most powerful empire of the ancient world. The political context was rife with uncertainties and tensions, but Octavian's strategic skill in consolidating power and eliminating his rivals allowed him to quickly achieve definitive leadership. Octavian's rise to absolute power was not a simple process. In the years following his victory at Actium and the suicides of Mark Antony and Cleopatra, Octavian had to deal with various internal and external challenges. Although he was widely regarded as the victor of the civil war that followed Caesar's death, the transition of power was delicate. The Roman Republic was in tatters, and the political system still operated in a way that required the maintenance of a balance of forces. However, Octavian knew how to exploit the weaknesses of his opponents and shape popular support, consolidating his position as the unquestionable leader. The great moment of Octavian's transformation into Augustus occurred in 27 BC, when he presented himself to the Roman Senate. Instead of explicitly declaring himself emperor, Octavian adopted a subtle discourse, offering the Senate the restoration of powers. He claimed to have taken powers from Rome during decades of instability. But in doing so, Octavian not only confirmed his position but also obtained absolute power under the guise of a renewal of the Republic. The Senate approved his proposal and granted him the title of Augustus. Augustus, the name that Octavian assumed represented the figure of the providential, almost divine leader who would restore peace and order to the empire. He became not only the supreme military commander but also the chief priest of Rome, a symbol of stability and continuity. This transformation into Augustus was not just a title but a revolution in the way of governing. Instead of following the traditional republican model, with temporary magistrates and divisions of power, Augustus became the centralized and lifelong ruler of Rome. He created the concept of the principate, where power was in the hands of a single leader, but under the appearance of functioning republican institutions. Augustus consolidated his power in a shrewd and strategic manner, maintaining an image of moderation and respect for Roman traditions. He knew that to ensure the longevity of his empire, he needed to build a narrative of continuity. Therefore, he made a point of presenting himself as the restorer of Rome's greatness, without abruptly breaking with the republican past. This granted him legitimacy among the senatorial class and the Roman people, who saw in Augustus the solution to the conflicts and crises that had marked recent history. Moreover, Octavian himself, upon becoming Augustus, not only assumed absolute power but also began to shape the structure of the empire in a way that would perpetuate for centuries. He initiated a period of reforms that stabilized the Roman economy, reorganized the army, and established a network of infrastructure, such as roads and aqueducts, that would unify the vast regions under his dominion. His reign also marked a new era of prosperity known as the Pax Romana, a period of relative peace and stability that would last over 200 years. With his rise, Augustus also became the symbol of a Rome transforming from a weakened republic, marked by divisions and internal disputes, into an imposing empire, with centralized power and an expansionist vision. His political and military skill was key to ensuring the stability of the empire, but his ability to present himself as a restorer of order rather than a tyrant secured him popularity among the Romans. The rise of Octavian to Augustus and the birth of the Roman Empire forever altered the fate of Rome and the Western world. The Roman Empire, founded by Augustus, would not only conquer new lands and expand its domains, but also establish a model of imperial governance that would influence the future of many nations. Therefore, the transformation of Octavian into Augustus was not merely a change of name or title, but the beginning of a new era, marked by centralized governance and an empire that, under his leadership, would become a global superpower. Augustus's rise as emperor not only marked the end of civil wars, but also signaled the beginning of a new way of governing, which ensured Rome the longevity and stability it had never experienced before. The figure of Augustus became an eternal symbol of power, and his name would be revered throughout the entire history of the empire. After securing his position as the first emperor of Rome, Augustus faced the challenge of consolidating his power and stabilizing an empire that had endured decades of civil wars and instability. His political and strategic skill was crucial in transforming the fragmented republican regime into a centralized and enduring empire. To achieve this goal, Augustus implemented a series of reforms that strengthened his government and shaped the future of Imperial Rome. The first of Augustus's reforms involved the reorganization of the armed forces, creating a permanent army known as the Roman legions. He paid soldiers a fixed salary and offered them land and benefits at the end of their service, ensuring direct loyalty to the emperor. Augustus instituted a personal guard called the Praetorian cohorts, responsible for protecting him and ensuring the security of Rome. These military reforms secured Augustus's position and marked the beginning of armies loyal to the emperor rather than the Senate or the Republic. Military power alone was not enough. Augustus focused on administrative reform to centralize control of the empire in his hands. He divided the empire into provinces governed by procurators chosen directly by him, bypassing Senate appointment. By establishing a centralized administration, Augustus strengthened his personal power and made the empire more efficient and cohesive. Augustus recognized the importance of ensuring order and social prosperity in Rome, adopting social and economic reforms. He reorganized tax collection, creating a more efficient and equitable system to secure necessary revenues for the empire. This change secured the financial stability of the empire and allowed it to maintain public services like roads and aqueducts. The restoration of Roman morality was a priority for Augustus, who believed moral decay had contributed to the collapse of Roman order. He implemented moral laws, such as the Julian laws, regulating marriage, public morality, and private conduct. These laws aimed to restore traditional Roman values and stabilize Roman society, providing a solid moral foundation. In parallel with internal reforms, Augustus worked to expand the empire's borders and ensure its security. During his reign, Rome conquered new lands and strengthened defenses in border regions. One of his greatest achievements was the pacification of distant provinces like Gaul and Hispania, consolidating the empire. He focused on a cautious foreign policy, avoiding large territorial expansions and preferring to consolidate control over conquered regions. Moreover, Augustus' urban reforms had a lasting impact on the city of Rome. He transformed Rome from a relatively simple city into a grand metropolis, filled with monuments, temples, and public buildings that symbolized the power and glory of the empire. His famous phrase, "I found Rome a city of bricks and left it a city of marble," reflects the magnitude of these urban reforms. He invested in large infrastructure projects, such as the construction of roads, aqueducts, and public buildings. These projects not only improved the quality of life in the city, but also solidified Rome's image as the center of the known world. The combination of these military, administrative, social, and urban reforms not only consolidated Augustus' power, but also stabilized the Roman Empire. The peace known as Pax Romana was one of Augustus' greatest achievements, allowing for the flourishing of the Roman economy and culture. Internal stability and order-maintaining policies resulted in an era of prosperity that would last for about 2 centuries. This period of relative peace would benefit future generations. Politically, Augustus implemented the principate, a system of government where he held supreme power while maintaining the appearance of intact republican institutions. By doing so, he managed to balance the desire for stability with the need to uphold the facade of a functioning republic, allowing him to govern with absolute authority without the resistance that an explicit monarchy might have generated. These reforms, and the way Augustus consolidated his power, demonstrated a deep understanding of the empire's needs and the political dynamics of Rome. His ability to govern with authority while preserving respect for traditions was key to his longevity in power. He not only stabilized the empire after years of civil war, but also created a model of governance that, with some modifications, would endure for centuries. These reforms ensured that the Roman Empire not only survived, but thrived under the rule of a single man, Augustus. The legacy of the Roman civil wars is undeniably one of the most determining forces in the formation of the empire that succeeded the Roman Republic. These wars, which spanned decades, not only destroyed the republican structure but also paved the way for a new model of government that would endure for centuries. By the end of the bloody battles, the assassination of prominent figures, and the rise of new leaders, Rome was irreversibly transformed. The empire that would emerge was very different from what existed in republican times, but in a way, its greatness was deeply rooted in the painful lessons and scars left by the civil wars. The Roman civil wars, with their endless conflicts between figures like Lucius Valerius and Aulus Cornelius, or the triumvirs fighting for absolute power, created a rift at the heart of Rome. The internal divisions among factions and the destruction of the republican fabric had a profound impact on how politics would be conducted from then on. The Republic, with its shared government system and control by the Senate, would no longer be a viable option. The open wounds from the struggles for supremacy and betrayals proved to be deeper than any possible reconciliation. However, despite the destruction and the dissolution of republican institutions, the end of the Civil War also marked a starting point for a new era. Gaius Aurelius, a leader who emerged from the shadow of chaos, was able to build a new political structure. Although many of Aurelius's reforms were disguised as republican continuities, the truth was that power was now centralized in the hands of a single man, the emperor. The transformation of Rome from a fragmented republic to a unified empire was not just a regime change. It was a paradigm shift, and the imperial government became the definitive model. The peace that followed the end of the civil wars, known as the Pax Romana, was a direct reflection of the need to restore order and stability after decades of chaos. While stability was maintained, the form of government was radically different. The rise of leaders like Aurelius, who consolidated their power with military, administrative, and social reforms, shaped a new path for Rome. The Roman Empire, with its loyal legions, a unified economy, and a centralized governance system, would become a model of political stability, but also an expansionist empire, conquering vast regions of the ancient world. The impact of the Roman civil wars was not only political, but also cultural and social. The destruction of republican institutions forever changed the way Romans viewed government. And many began to associate the empire with the continuity of greatness, not only through military victories, but also through the construction of an imperial identity. As a result, Roman culture flourished, and a new spirit of Romanity spread across all provinces, where loyalty to the emperor became more important than loyalty to the republic. The imperial structure, established after Aurelius's rise, also paved the way for the dynasties that would succeed his rule. These dynasties, based on hereditary power, would continue to expand the empire and ensure its survival for over 1,000 years. However, the seeds of the civil wars, with their struggles for supremacy, would always be present in the empire's subconscious, reflecting the constant internal struggle. Moreover, the transition to the empire did not only mean the consolidation of Aurelius's power, it also brought forth new challenges, such as the administration of such a vast and diverse empire, which required political, economic, and social adaptations. The immense bureaucracy created by Aurelius expanded over time, but the legacy of imperial management still bore the scars of the civil wars, where control and centralization of power were central issues. The impact of the civil wars also had a lasting effect on the relations between Rome and its provinces. As the empire expanded, the provinces, which had previously been mere sources of resources and troops, began to integrate more deeply into the Roman administrative machine. However, the distrust and resistance to centralized power, intensified by civil conflicts, would never completely disappear. Although the Roman Empire achieved internal peace, the core of the struggle for supremacy never ceased to exist, reflected in the various revolts and resistances throughout imperial history. On a more personal level, the Roman civil wars also changed the way the Roman elite viewed their role in the empire. With Aurelius's rise, the traditional families that had previously held power in the Senate and republican institutions now found themselves in a new context. While many aligned themselves with the new regime, a new class of imperial and military servants gained prominence. Aurelius's model of governance allowed the elite to be reshaped, but it also made the empire increasingly dependent on military support and imperial bureaucracy for its survival. In summary, the Roman civil wars, with their bloody battles and political betrayals, were not only a period of destruction, but also of great transformation. They shaped the future of the Roman Empire, giving it the form of a centralized and militarized regime. This transformation not only ended the Republic, but also paved the way for an era of relative stability and expansion, which would mark the height of the empire for many centuries. The legacy of these wars, with all their consequences, cannot be underestimated. It was they who defined the course of Rome and ensured that the city that once governed a small territory became the greatest power of the ancient world, establishing a model of governance that would influence empires throughout history. Thank you for watching until now. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to continue receiving upcoming content. See you in the next video.